What we're going to talk about today is different types of climate and the distribution of different types of ecosystems, and different types of plants, I should say. So we need to talk about. We've already talked about climate, so we'll talk about what the names are for those different ecosystems types we're going to talk about, and then that'll really be like a background for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the semester. So I just wanted to bring up this Whittaker diagram. In your readings from last week, you were introduced to the Whittaker diagram. This is really just where the dominant biomes are located within what we would call climate space. So we've got mean annual precip on the x-axis, and this is in centimeters. So we go from 0 to 450 centimeters, or in millimeters, that would be 4,500 millimeters. The thing to keep an eye on is that this y-axis here is reversed. We've got the coldest places up top, and it gets to the warmer places at the bottom. All right? But this space here then where the biomes are all located, that's referred to as the climate space. So you can see our tropical rainforests are in the warmest, so lowest part of this axis, and the wettest places around the world. Vice versa, our deserts over here are located in hot places and can be in fairly cold places, but they're all on the really dry end of the precipitation gradient. All right, and then we've got a bunch of other biomes occupying the middle of the space there. All right, so get familiar with this diagram a little bit as we go through and talk about the biomes today. You should start being able to think about where that biome is located in this climate space, all right? And we're going to talk about, I think, most of these biomes. We might leave out one or two, but for the most part, we'll cover all of these biomes, all right? So this is the Whittaker diagram. And then this is just a map of where the kind of major biome types are. So here is a list of 7 biome types that I'm sure you've heard of before. You probably learned as far back as maybe elementary school. So this will be kind of a quick review here. Hopefully we'll take it a little more intellectually stimulating than grade school. So we're going to talk about these 7 biomes and some examples of each one. Before we get into it, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with angiosperm versus gymnosperm. We're going to be talking about the differences between these types of plants quite a bit, and they come up in some of our examples of biomes and our plant functional groups that we're going to talk about next. So the angiosperm, gymnosperm really just represent this a divergence in evolution. They have very different evolutionary pathways, these types of plants, and so they function quite differently. The way we kind of distinguish them most, I guess, easiest from our eyes is just the types of seeds they have. So angiosperms, they have their seeds covered in an ovary or a fruit. So think of basically any fruit is going to have, you've got an orange with all this fruity, fleshy material around it, and then you've got the seeds in the middle, right? So it's the seeds are always encapsulated inside this ovary. The gymnosperms are what's referred to as a naked seed. The seeds are not encased in an ovary. They're just seeds out there on their own, so to speak, all right? So that's kind of how we often describe them is based on their seed, but there's a whole lot of other anatomical differences and physiological differences between angiosperms and gymnosperms, which will become increasingly important as we go through the semester. The thing for today to remember is that gymnosperms, we're really talking about our needle leaf trees, so our ponderosa pine and our blue spruce, our juniper and our pinyon pine. Those are all gymnosperms, whereas our maples, our oak trees, our quaking aspen, those are all angiosperms, all right? So let's get into the different biomes real quick and give some definitions here. So let's talk about forests first. Forests are biomes that are dominated by trees, but those trees have what we call a continuous canopy layer, all right? And what that really just means is that if we were to look at if we were to go to a forest and pick out 2 trees, their canopies of each individual tree would probably be overlapping each other, meaning the leaves of each tree are kind of intermingling. So on the bottom left here, I have just a hemispherical photo to show you this. And then here on the right is somebody taking one of these hemispherical photos. So they just have this fisheye lens pointed up into the canopy, and they can actually quantify leaf area up in the canopy. But if you look at this image, you can see these stems from a bunch of trees coming in from the outer part of this image. But up top, you can't really distinguish where each of those trees begin and where they end. Their leaves are all kind of overlapping. And so this would be considered a continuous canopy layer. All right? So let's just talk about a couple of examples of these, especially ones that we will cover in this class. So we have, broadly speaking, we have temperate forests is one type of forest. So these are going to be forests found in a temperate climate. We have temperate rainforests. We have just a little sliver of temperate rainforests in Florida, but that's it. And then we have a little bit of temperate rainforest, often, well, let me back up and say this a little more accurately. People often refer to the Pacific Northwest as a temperate rainforest. And then we have temperate deciduous forests. So you think of what's on the eastern U.S. and all the beautiful fall colors that happen in the New England area. That'd be a temperate deciduous forest. So those are two examples of temperate forests. We could also have a continental forest. So these are also referred to as boreal forests. So these are forests occurring in places that get pretty darn cold, not quite polar, but really cold forests. These are usually at high latitude, in high latitudes. So think of boreal forests. And then fourthly, we have tropical forests. Now, remember when we talked about tropical climates, we defined it as being a place where the monthly temperature is always above 18 degrees C. And we did not define it based on precipitation. I grew up always thinking that tropical forests were always rainforests and they were always wet. All right, but that's not true. We have some dry rainforests, some really dry rainforests actually, and those are tropical deciduous forests. So our tropical rainforests are dominated by broadleaf evergreen trees. And in this case, when I say broadleaf, I'm really just meaning angiosperms. It's dominated by angiosperms that are evergreen versus tropical deciduous forest, obviously dominated by deciduous trees, also typically angiosperm. And in the tropical deciduous forest, we have this very distinct dry season. So this image on the right is just showing a tropical dry forest in that dry season when there's very little leaves on the trees. Okay, so those are our forests. Remember, forests they're dominated by trees and they have a continuous canopy layer. And we have temperate forests, continental forests, and tropical forests. All right. So then let's go on and talk about woodlands. So woodlands differ slightly from forests. They're also dominated by trees, as you can see in the first bullet point here. The difference is that the canopy layer is discontinuous, meaning there's a lot of gaps between individual trees and lots of space between individual trees. So let me just jump ahead for a second to the next slide. If you look at this picture on the kind of upper left here, this is of a juniper woodland in the Great Basin, and you can see all the individual trees and lots of space between them, especially on the right-hand side of this hill. They're a little more dense on the left side, but you can still see lots of open space between them, and that's because there's a discontinuous tree layer. All right, so that's the difference really between a woodland and a forest. They're both dominated by trees. One has a continuous layer, one is discontinuous, and that discontinuous tree canopy layer allows there to be a lot of grasses growing in the understory. So there's often a large grass component to woodlands. And when we think about productivity of these systems, we think about a division of labor. The grasses grow really fast when there's moisture available, but once that moisture is gone, the grasses tend to senesce, but the trees continue growing because they have much deeper roots. And so they kind of grow at different times of year and under different conditions. So the two types of woodlands we often talk about are sclerophyllous woodlands and thorn woodlands. Sclerophyllous just refers to the type of leaves they have. They have really tough, thick leaves is a sclerophyllous woodland, and then a thorny woodland is just dominated by trees that typically have some kind of thorns on them. These are just a couple more images of woodlands. This is in France. This is in the Blue Mountains, which kind of run on the eastern side of Australia. And these These two here would be sclerophyllous woodlands. And then our thorn woodlands, one example we have in North America is the mesquite woodlands of Texas, where a lot of the woody vegetation, especially the mesquite, has some kind of thorny structures on them. But again, you have a discontinuous layer with lots of grass. All right, that's our woodlands. Yeah, again, our pinyon juniper woodland in the US is another example. All right, let's talk about shrublands. And then our next one is going to be scrublands. All right, and the difference between shrubland and scrubland is very similar to the difference between forest and woodlands. So a shrubland is a near continuous layer of shrubs that are up to several meters high. So maybe about 3 meters would be about the maximum for a shrub. But these are going to still be dominated by woody plants, just not trees. And the shrubs in these systems have a continuous layer. So they're packed tight together so that their canopies are overlapping. So a couple examples are the chaparral in California is a shrubland, and this is a picture of the chaparral. This is a really fire-adapted system. There's lots of fires in these areas. We have the sagebrush steppe. This is a picture from Washington near the Columbia River. And if you can see it better than I can, let me enlarge this a little bit. These are the shrubs here, and they're just really dense. You can't really see any spacing between them. And then another one, if you're not familiar with, is the fynbos in South Africa. So in the near Cape Town in South Africa, just south of Cape Town, there's this area referred to as the fynbos. And there's just this huge variety of different shrubs in this area, but they're just packed together. It's super dense. I don't know if you can see it. I got to go down there once and took this picture. There's some ostriches back in here running through the shrubs of the fynbos. So that's another example of a shrubland with fairly dense vegetation. Oh, and then one more. I told you that the height can be several meters in height. Before moving to this area, I always just pictured shrubs as being maybe up to my waist. But I was on a trip with my kids in West Colorado, and this was at Dinosaur National Monument, and I loved seeing how big some of the sagebrush were. This one is pushing that 3 meters high, maybe even a little bit more. So do keep in mind that some shrubs can get really tall. Okay, so that's shrubland. And then we have either a scrub, or I'm going to call it a scrubland for now, but some people just call it scrub ecosystem. Again, this is much like a shrubland, dominated by shrubs, but again, it has a discontinuous canopy layer. So this left-hand picture also shows you the sagebrush steppe, and you can see all the spacing between them. Do keep in mind that I also showed you the sagebrush steppe for a shrubland, and it can occur in either state, if you will. It can have a discontinuous layer or a continuous layer. We also have the creosote bush scrub in New Mexico, where we've got the shrubs here with lots of space in between, or a discontinuous canopy. All right, now a grassland. This is fairly a no-brainer, I guess, but grasslands are dominated primarily by grasses, but they're also dominated by forbs, and we'll talk a little bit about forbs in the next video. So if you're not sure what a forb is, just hang on. I'll define it in the next video. But both of these are herbaceous plants. They don't have woody tissue, and there's very little woody vegetation present in a grassland. The two examples I'm going to give you are a temperate grassland, which much of the grasslands we have in the US would be considered temperate grasslands, or we have the steppe, from Russian word meaning vast treeless plain, which refers to semi-arid grasslands. So this is just a few pictures of the kind of dominant grassland types we have in the US. This is the tallgrass prairie in Kansas. This is the mixed grass prairie. This picture was taken up in Montana. And then we have the shortgrass steppe. This is a picture taken from about 45 minutes east of Fort Collins. So just some different types of grassland, temperate grasslands there. And that's all we'll have to know for that. Deserts then. I think we probably all have an image of what a desert looks like, but the way we would actually go about defining it and determining if it's a desert or not is measuring how much of the ground is covered by plants and how much is open or bare ground that doesn't have any vegetation covering it. And so in a desert, when more than half of the area is covered by bare ground, then you've got a desert ecosystem. If it's more, if you got more than 50% vegetation cover, then it's not a desert. Then it would probably be a scrubland or potentially a woodland. All right. So just a couple of the deserts we have in the U.S. Of course, we have the Mojave Desert in California. You can see all the open areas here between these little patches of grasses. And then also here, this is the desert grassland in New Mexico. Again, lots of open bare ground, just a little bit of spots of vegetation there. So that's going to be your definition for desert. And then lastly, we have the tundra. So tundra comes from the Finnish word tunturi. I'm sure I pronounced it wrong, something like that, meaning treeless plain. So it's very similar to the Russian word for steppe, but this is a Finnish word, and it's really referring to much colder climates than what you would have for grasslands. So these areas, again, don't have trees or very many trees, so they're dominated by grasses, forbs, and shrubs. And it's also characterized by really cold temperatures. So often we're talking either continental climates or polar climates are associated with tundra ecosystems. And there's two types of tundra. There's Arctic tundra and there's alpine tundra. Alpine tundra is the tundra vegetation that's found at high elevations. So if you were to drive up the Rocky Mountains, you go into Rocky Mountain National Park and drive the road across, you would be driving through what we call alpine tundra. If you were to hop in your car and drive north and go up through Canada and into Alaska, then you would drive into the Arctic tundra, where we're talking about the tundra vegetation due to the northern latitudes or high latitudes. The vegetation is quite similar, but we have different words for each of them. So in this class, we'll talk some about alpine tundra. We won't really talk about Arctic tundra. All right? Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about associated with the different biomes. So you just need to know those biomes, you need to know the definition of each biome, and then the examples I gave you. All right, so I gave you a few examples for most of them, not all of them. All right, so make sure you know those, be studying those for the exam. I am going to stop the video now, and then I will make a third video that will be associated with plant functional groups. So there will be a quiz posted on Canvas associated with just this second video. So I didn't actually name the quiz yet, but it will probably be biome definition quiz or something like that. And that's what will be associated with this second video. All right, I will be back in just a few minutes to go over the third video.